Hello and welcome to episode 5 of the Wisdom from the Akasha podcast. My name is Susie and I am your host. I am an Akashic Records teacher and I also do one-on-one sessions with people in the form of Akashic Records readings and Akashic clearings. As many of you listening will know, I have been on my own spiritual journey for a very long time. Today, I really want to talk about the difference between the direct and the indirect paths and what I feel are the benefits of each and the potential pitfalls of each path. There is a lot of confusion out there in social media in respect of spiritual paths and spiritual development. A lot of the time, people will make reference to certain practices, certain techniques, and not reference the tradition or the path that comes from. I sometimes wish that during my personal spiritual awakening that I had access to social media because I think there are many amazing, great bits of information and advice out there for people who are going through different stages of the awakening journey. Other times, I am actually quite grateful that a lot of my deeper, darker parts of my spiritual awakening took place before these were really conversations that were discussed on social media and before we had social media in the form that we currently have it. And I say that because I think that for a lot of people, if they are having a spiritual awakening and they go onto social media to try and understand what is happening to them, what they are experiencing, it can be very difficult to navigate information and advice that makes sense to them. A lot of people will reach out to me saying, I don't understand. Am I supposed to have a specific diet? Is this practice better than this practice? And it creates a lot of confusion for people in a time that is already very confusing for that individual. I predominantly focus on embodied and grounded spiritual development. And when I'm creating content for social media, I'm doing it from the perspective of that grounded and embodied perspective. Don't get me wrong, I love to really get a deep dive into higher level esoteric concepts, things that people would maybe call a little bit woo woo. But I think when we're talking to people who are going through various different stages of the awakening journey, it's very important to remember that sometimes we need to go back to basics on certain topics and explain what these paths are, what the practices are designed to do, and how the awakening process is going to unfurl for each individual, because it's going to be unique for each individual. And each individual is going to be drawn to different practices and different paths based on what their soul has worked with in previous incarnations. We have this magnetic center, and we are constantly creating and strengthening this magnetic center. That magnetic center is designed to pull towards you certain paths, certain teachers, certain practices as you go through your spiritual journey. It's never any surprise when somebody is drawn to a specific path or a specific practice or teacher when you look at it from the Akashic Records perspective, because there is often a connection that they have had to that path, practice, or teacher throughout many incarnations. All of the paths that are out there and the practices that are connected to those paths fall into these two categories. They are either direct or indirect. Before I get into the specifics of each path, what you will see as we go through this conversation is I am a firm believer of a balance of both for most people, and I will explain why as we go through this conversation. The indirect path is also sometimes known as the progressive path, and this indirect path is the path of self-improvement. This is the path where most spiritual teachers focus their time and attention on. And this is the path where you're going to find lots of different practices that you have all come across things like breath work, certain yoga practices, different practices and techniques to help you with your shadow work, to help you with your inner child healing. From an energetic perspective, this is often the journey through the lower primary chakras. What you will see with most people who are going through their spiritual awakening, they have had this awakening experience where they have started to ask these bigger picture questions. They've started to really look at themselves and their lives and to want to see it from this more soul level perspective. And they start with facing the root chakra level. And this has a lot to do with inner child work, oftentimes ancestral work comes up with root chakra, nervous system regulation, moving past those feelings of safety and security and having those basic needs met. Then they move into the sacral chakra level, where you start to really understand that all emotions are valid and that you have gone through much of your life repressing certain emotions. And when you're in the sacral chakra level, there's a lot of focus on practices like somatic practices where you're getting into the body and you're moving through those stuck emotions. So, breathwork practices, movement practices, they're often involved in unsticking the stuck emotions, moving that stagnant energy through. There is also the need at that stage to really honor and learn how to feel all emotions. If you have been taught, for example, that anger is an unsafe or bad emotion, at this stage, you start to realize that anger is a perfectly valid emotion, and you have to learn ways to transmute and alchemize that anger. As people move into the solar plexus level of the awakening process, they start to really take radical self responsibility and to understand that they are not the victim of circumstances, that they have a say, that they have free will, and they are a co-creator of their own reality. A lot of people will come into spiritual development and spiritual teachings at the solar plexus level through the conversations that are very popular at the moment around manifestation, the I create my own reality conversation. The solar plexus level is very much about self-empowerment, but the getting stuck in the I am the creator of my own reality stops the individual moving into the heart chakra level of development, which is all about surrender and unconditional love. For most people on their awakening journey, it isn't a linear process as I'm describing. It isn't root chakra to sacral chakra to solar plexus chakra into heart chakra. What ordinarily happens is you cycle through these various energy centers over and over again. So, for example, you may have dealt with inner child wounding at the root chakra level. You may have moved into processing of all of your emotions in the sacral chakra level, and then more inner child wounding may come up. That is completely normal. To cycle through these different energy centers, to be working on more than one of these energy centers at a time is completely normal. But the working on these different energy centers and the practices used for these different energy centers are very connected to the indirect paths that are out there. The purpose of the indirect paths and the practices associated with those paths is essentially clearing the energy bodies out. It's moving energetic stagnation, which makes space for direct path practices. With indirect practices, you are constantly working towards an end. You are constantly in the position of seeker. And it's very normal for people to spend many years on the indirect path, clearing out everything, working through their karma, healing from their traumas. It is completely normal for that to take time for people. But the ego is still very involved in the indirect path. Oftentimes, when people have that first initial awakening experience, they think that they have killed the ego off, and that is not the case. The ego may have been weakened, it may have been partially removed, but there is still an ego there. And the problem, if you stay with indirect practices and indirect paths only for too long, is you're going to develop a spiritual ego, because the ego is working on something. You are working on something. This constant self improvement is giving sustenance to the ego. It's that kind of, look at me, I'm so good. I have such a dedicated spiritual practice. I get up at 5 a.m., I do my breath work, I do my journaling, I do my all of I'm doing, still retains this separation, this idea of there being a separate self. It is very normal for somebody to reach a stage while they are undertaking these practices on the indirect path and say, I just am completely fed up and exhausted. I just constantly seem to be trying to fix myself. And that magnetic center that we talked about at that stage starts to draw into them direct path practices and teachings. The direct path is this remembrance that I am unconditional love. I am source consciousness. It is the abiding in unconditional love. And the only real practice in a direct path is trying to hold that abidance of unconditional love, being in that frequency of unconditional love as much as you possibly can throughout your normal day. Going through your normal daily activities and always bringing your awareness and your attention back to that frequency of unconditional love. From the energetic perspective, this abidance in unconditional love is very associated with heart chakra awareness. So you will often hear words such as surrender, gratitude, humility, compassion, kindness being references to practices associated with the direct path. This is very much the stage of being rather than doing. You're not seeking to go anywhere to fix anything. You're seeking to stay in that presence, in that awareness of unconditional love. You are not trying to change yourself or the life circumstances around you. You are in complete acceptance with everything that is going on around you. And the only thing you may be asking yourself is, what is the lesson here for me? Traditionally, these are the paths of non-dual inquiry, such as devotion. On the direct path, you are essentially surrendering that lower self, the egoic self, very much associated with those lower three primary chakras, for your higher self. You are embodying your soul more than letting your ego run the show. Unfortunately, what happens if somebody goes into direct path practices before their magnetic center has really called them to the direct path, what can happen is people can very much be focus on the world being all illusion, and therefore emotions are not valid. It's all just an illusion. So why should we try to change anything? Why should we care about anything? This is one of the main pitfalls with the direct path, that when people come to it too early, they go into spiritual bypassing. They don't want to look at any of those issues that, had they gone to the indirect path, that they would have come to face. They don't want to look at their shadow. They don't want to look at any healing work that they have to do. It can, of course, be really difficult for somebody if they come across direct path teachings too early and they try to connect to that unconditional love, that source consciousness. If they have blocks to being able to connect to that, they can spend a lot of time doing these practices and not actually feel anything from it, not actually be able to connect to that unconditional love because of repressed emotions, because of traumas that they've experienced. What can confuse matters even more is people can have these experiences of bliss, of being in unconditional love. The experience often referred to as Satori, this enlightened experience, and this can last anywhere from an hour to a month, sometimes even longer. This happens a lot with people who have experienced a spontaneous Kundalini awakening. They go into this extremely high blissful state, but of course, they aren't holding that state forever. They have to essentially come back to reality. And when they do come back to reality, the ego who has been absent for that time that they have been in that heightened consciousness, in that heightened level of awareness, comes back strong and really comes back highlighting all the areas where you are not worthy of that experience of unconditional love, where you should be feeling shame for all of these mistakes that you have made in the past. And this can often throw people into a very dark period of depression, can trigger another dark night of the soul for that individual. And this can be very discombobulating because they have had this experience of this state, of this higher consciousness, but they have been unable to hold on to it. And they don't understand why they are being thrown back into that energy. And at that stage, it would be wise for someone to go back into indirect practices and really focus on all of the stuff that is coming for them, but they can often feel like they did something wrong or they weren't good enough to hold that state. When that isn't true, that state is always available to them. It is just often that the channels to holding that state for prolonged periods of times need to be cleared out. Space needs to be made. This is why I believe that being aware of these two paths, the indirect and the direct path, and the practices associated with each path, should be followed in tandem with each other. If you are someone who has been following the indirect path for a long time and you're at that stage now where you're like, I have done the work, I am so fed up and tired of all of this self improvement, it's time for you to add some direct path practice in, some abiding in this frequency of unconditional love. And you can add this in at any point in your spiritual journey, but be mindful of the fact that you may have to run these two in tandem for some time. And it can be really good to feel into part of my day, part of my spiritual practice, I am going to spend on those indirect practices because I know how I have got XYZ work to do. But I'm also going to add some time in just to sit in that frequency of unconditional love. When people come to learn how to access their own Akashic records, that is the first thing that they notice, that going into the Akashic records is sitting in that frequency of unconditional love. And it's a beautiful experience for them. But it doesn't mean that because they have started that work that it's time to just drop all of the indirect path practices, because there can be lots of things holding them back to being able to be the clearest channel that they have the potential to be. After you have started to add in these more direct paths and these more direct teachings, you are then able to start enhancing more of your practice into the direct path practices and less time on the indirect path practices. The key as you are doing this is to be very aware of your ego in this process and to really focus on humility as much as possible, because your ego is going to try to come along and say, oh, look at me, look how enlightened I am, look how much I'm able to connect to unconditional love. And it's very important to be aware of this so that you can remind yourself that there is no separate self. And this is where humility comes in. the more time you spend giving credit to unconditional love, to source consciousness, to God, and less time giving credit to yourself, the more you are practicing humility. And practicing humility is going to cultivate qualities within you, such as patience, such as kindness, such as honesty, because you can't be impatient if you are being humble. You can't be unkind to others if you are truly experiencing oneness. Someone who has genuinely attained enlightenment will not tell you that they have attained enlightenment. What you will find with them is they are extremely humble. I hope that after listening to all of this, you can see why I will always suggest to people a balance of both paths, and only starting to go into the direct path when that magnetic center is calling it in for you. I hope that you have found this as a really useful introduction to the direct and the indirect spiritual paths. Of course, I have not gone into the benefits and the disadvantages of specific individual paths because we would be here for a very long time. And what I wanted to do is just give you an overview of the two different paths, when you will feel called to practices on one and the other, and potentially thinking about balancing the two on your own path in the ratio that is right for you at this time. For those of you who are new to your spiritual awakening journey, I hope that this has given you some clarity so that when you are out there on social media looking at these different things, you can feel into what is right for you. Everybody's spiritual development is unique and individual to them. So please don't ever feel like you are doing it wrong, that you have to do this practice or that practice. Try to use your internal navigation system as much as possible. Try to strengthen that magnetic center as much as possible so that you are calling in practices and teachers that are right for you. If you are somebody who is wanting to really understand the journey through the chakra system that I have talked about, I am going to be covering the root chakra and everything that happens with the root chakra in our membership meeting on the 31st of March. The monthly membership is going to be a very fun way to connect, to discuss these types of topics, and there's a great community of people who are joining the membership. You also get access to previously held workshops, such as the Starseed workshop, the Subcontracts workshop, a workshop on Atlantis and Lemuria. They're all held in a video library, which you can access through the members area. If this is something that you would like to look at more, if you'd like to understand more about the root chakra, why it's so important to get that root chakra balanced before doing anything else in respect of spiritual development, then please do consider signing up for the membership. I shall, of course, add the link down in the show notes. And thank you all for listening along this week, and have an amazing weekend.